It was a brutally cold, rainy night. A sleek black limousine slammed violently into the guardrail. Its front end crumpled. Smoke rose from the wreck. A man rushed toward the carnage. He wrenched the twisted door open and pulled out a woman draped in a blood-soaked white evening dress. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he yelled. She opened her eyes. Her voice was a fragile, broken plea. "Please, just make it fast," he whispered fiercely. "I won't let anyone die." She offered a cynical smile. "I am the person everyone hates. You don't need to try so hard." "That's exactly why I must." In the storm's chaos, this stranger became the single, unexpected reason the disgraced CEO would choose to live again. The man was Lucas Reed. He was 37, a single dad, and a former Army combat nurse who now worked part-time driving an ambulance for a private company. His true purpose, however, was his 9-year-old daughter, Ella. Ella was vibrant, constantly sketching doctor's notes, and fiercely believed that every single person in the world deserved to be saved. Lucas knew the brutal reality of the opposite. He had lost his wife, Sarah, years ago, a talented surgeon who died on the operating table due to complications following a chaotic battlefield retrieval. Since that day, Lucas harbored a deep, paralyzing fear of failing to save someone. He felt safer driving the aid, avoiding the front line of care because the guilt of losing Sarah had become an impenetrable mental wall. He feared if he tried and failed again, he might truly break. Tonight, however, there was no choice. He was off duty, driving home in his beat-up pickup truck when the accident unfolded right in front of him. The sight of the smoke and mangled metal triggered something deep inside. The oath he swore long ago. He sprinted across 3 lanes of traffic. The smell of burning oil and hot asphalt was overwhelming. His army training kicked in, filtering out the chaos. He ignored the horn blaring from a slowing semi-truck and focused on the crumpled limo. The victim he pulled from the wreckage was Clara Moretti, 33 years old. She was the infamous CEO of Moretti Holdings. In the media, she was known for her ruthless mergers and cold demeanor, having recently finalized a high-profile divorce. They called her the Ice Queen. He didn't know any of that. He only saw a casualty, a life draining away. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. She was fading fast. As he tore a strip from his own shirt, a gray cotton blend, to staunch a deep laceration on her forehead, her eyes fluttered open. The dark centers looked lost, vacant. Then came the whisper that stopped his heart. "Please, just make it fast." The phrase, raw and heartbreaking, mirrored the silent pleas he had seen in the eyes of wounded soldiers who had simply given up. It was a cry for release. It reminded him violently of the moment he saw Sarah wheeled away, her fight lost. He pressed harder on the wound, his voice firm, overriding the fear. "You are not going to die tonight. I won't allow it. We are going to fight this." He quickly assessed her, recognizing the signs of internal trauma and broken ribs. He worked with a surgical precision he thought he had forgotten. After securing her on a makeshift backboard, he carefully transferred her to the arriving ambulance. Inside, the lights were sterile and bright. As he worked efficiently to stabilize her, applying oxygen, starting an IV, she regained a moment of painful clarity. She tried to push his hands away weakly. "You have no idea who I am," she rasped, her voice thick with self-loathing. "You should leave me alone. Let the system handle it." Shimmer. Lucas focused on the needle in his hand, his eyes never leaving the flow rate. "It doesn't matter," he replied calmly, his voice steadying the frantic pace of the moment. "The moment I touched you, you became my responsibility. All blood is red." He stayed with her, defying protocol. He walked the gurney himself, insisted on seeing her into the trauma bay, and then positioned himself right outside the operating theater. He waited there for 7 grueling hours. Every time the red light flashed, signaling a crisis inside, Lucas felt the return of terror. He told himself, "I cannot fail again." This fight wasn't just for her. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim the faith he had lost with Sarah. Finally, the surgery was over. She had survived. When Clara woke up hours later, groggy and stitched, the first thing she saw was him. Lucas was slumped in a vinyl chair, exhausted, his head bowed, but his fingers were lightly tracing the line of her wrist. He was still monitoring her pulse, his body acting on instinct, counting the beats. "Who are you?" she murmured. He lifted his head, startled, and pulled his hand away quickly. "Just a passerby, ma'am. You're stable now." She watched him. He looked tired, bruised but intensely present. She felt the lingering warmth of his hand. "I don't remember anyone holding my hand for this long," she admitted, a tremor of confusion in her tone. "Not even my ex-husband." He just nodded, relieved, and finally walked away, disappearing into the pale, sterile light of the hospital corridor, the weight of the night finally lifting. One of the OR nurses later recalled the night. The paramedics had gone, but that one man, Lucas Reed, he never left the surgical floor. He just kept pacing outside. When I asked him why, he said, and I'll never forget it, "If she lives, if she makes it through this, I will finally believe there's a good, solid reason I'm still in this profession." See, he needed her to live more than she did. Clara's recovery was slow, painful, and deeply unsettling. She was alive, but the world she returned to was messy. Her driver had perished in the crash, adding another layer to her crushing guilt. She had multiple fractured ribs and had narrowly escaped fatal damage to her heart. She was broken, physically and internally. She immediately ordered her team to arrange a discreet transfer to a private, luxurious rehabilitation facility in Switzerland. She wanted the highest walls, the most complete isolation. Lucas, however, was waiting when the paperwork arrived, holding a clipboard like an angry, off-duty security guard. "I'm stopping this," he said flatly, standing in the doorway. Clara, propped up in bed, glared at him, a flicker of her old authority returning. "Excuse me? You have no authority here. This is a private matter. I will not have a former paramedic dictating my recovery." "It's a matter of patient stability and psychological integrity," Lucas countered, unfazed. "You are not well enough to be moved, and your doctors agree. Moving you now is selfish. For now, I'm still responsible for the patient I saved." "You have absolutely no such obligation," she countered. "I am not your patient. I am your debt to be repaid, and I will repay you generously, then you can leave." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, his gaze penetrating her defenses. "I don't want your money, Miss Moretti. I want to see you heal. I do have an obligation, a better one than money. My daughter Ella has a rule. She told me, if you save someone, you have to stick around and make sure they can smile again. Until you genuinely smile, I'm not done." The statement was so profoundly earnest and utterly ridiculous in her corporate world that Clara couldn't help it. A tiny, painful, and genuine laugh escaped her. It sounded like rusty metal grinding. "A child's rule," she scoffed weakly. But the sound was already a confession. After she was finally discharged 2 weeks later, Clara tracked him down. She needed to close this debt, pay the man, and disappear into her usual fortress of solitude. She found him living in a worn-out, working-class apartment complex. The hallway smelled of old frying oil and damp laundry. The contrast with her penthouse, where every surface was marble and glass, was jarring. Lucas, the single dad, lived simply but richly in life. He invited her in. The apartment was small but tidy. The living room walls were covered in Ella's bright, messy artwork. He put a kettle on for tea, and Clara found herself standing awkwardly in his tiny living space, feeling enormous and out of place. Her eyes were drawn to a small, faded picture frame on a bookshelf. It held a photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes, dressed in a white surgical coat. "She was your wife?" Clara asked softly, pointing, sensing the profound gravity of the subject. Lucas turned, his expression softening instantly, touched by memory. "Yeah, Sarah. She died on the operating table in 2016. A complication that shouldn't have happened. After that, I couldn't trust hospitals anymore. I don't believe in miracle cures, and I certainly don't trust the systems that allow people to die over paperwork. I only believe in time. Time to heal, time to forget." Clara took the mug of tea he offered. The ceramic was chipped, but warm. "And yet," she pressed, looking him straight in the eye, determined to understand this contradiction, You still run out into the rain to save people. You lost your faith in the system, but you keep saving people? His eyes held hers. There was a raw, ancient pain in them. Because I know exactly what it feels like, he said, his voice dropping low, gravelly with stored emotion. To be in a moment where you desperately want to let go, to choose death over fighting, and have absolutely no one there to hold you back. I was that person watching her die. I won't let anyone else feel that abandonment. The comment was a physical blow to Clara. She gripped the mug, tears suddenly stinging her eyes. That was the core of her existence. The isolation, the control, the desire to just end the struggle. Lucas the stranger understood a profound loneliness she thought only she possessed. He saw past the CEO, past the Ice Queen, to the vulnerable wreck beneath the fractured ribs. She looked around the room again. It was warm, saturated with a life she hadn't known since childhood. There was a comforting clutter, books piled high, Ella's school bag tossed carelessly by the door, and a small, homemade Christmas tree crafted from construction paper. "Your daughter is sweet," Clara murmured genuinely. "You've done well, Lucas." Lucas nodded, a rare smile appearing. "She thought you needed this more than me. She insists on healing the healer." He walked over to the kitchen counter and handed Clara a tiny, exquisitely folded paper crane. It was the size of a thumbnail, fragile and precious. Scrawled on its wing in messy crayon were 4 words, "Heal slow. That's okay." It was simple, direct, and completely without judgment. Clara Moretti, the Ice Queen who had weathered hostile takeovers and media firestorms without blinking, looked at the fragile message and started to weep silently, the tears falling into her chipped tea mug. Her tears felt less like sadness and more like a long overdue complete thaw. She hadn't cried like this since she was a child. The paper crane felt like an absolution she desperately needed. Mrs. Chen, a neighbor on the second floor, told a reporter, "I see the CEO, yes, that CEO, coming back to this old neighborhood every week now. She drives a plain car and just walks up the stairs. She brings fresh baked goods and spends an hour just reading silly picture books with Lucas's little girl. She never talks business. The oddest thing is, she's always smiling when she leaves. I've never seen that woman smile before, not even on the news." A month passed, marked by Clara's weekly quiet visits. She was drawn to the genuine warmth of Lucas's life, a warmth that slowly began to counteract the coldness of her own empire. She felt addicted to the uncomplicated sincerity of their small world. Then Clara decided it was time to close the transaction. The feeling of guilt began to scream again. She had to confess. She invited Lucas and Ella to the towering Moretti Holdings headquarters, a glass castle that touched the clouds. They sat in her vast, minimalist office, overlooking the entire glittering city. The opulence was overwhelming, an intimidating display of power designed to make visitors feel small. "I want to sponsor Ella's education," Clara began, placing a heavy folder bound in blue leather on the polished mahogany desk. "From elementary school all the way through medical school, if she chooses. The funds are irrevocable. Consider it. A proper thank you for saving my life, Lucas." Lucas pushed the folder back across the desk. He looked completely unimpressed. "We don't take charity money, Ms. Moretti. My daughter's future is built on her hard work, not handouts." Clara sighed. "This is not charity. It's a guaranteed trust fund. It is purely transactional." "Transactions end," Lucas replied, his voice losing its politeness. "Our relationship is based on something that doesn't have a price tag. I pulled you out of the wreck because it was right. Pay for my time, if you must. But don't try to buy my daughter's future or my silence." "Then what is it?" Lucas challenged, his eyes narrowed, sensing a new, terrible tension in the air. The atmosphere in the immense room began to shift, growing heavy, expectant. Clara leaned forward. Her composure finally cracked, not like glass, but like a deep structural fracture. Her voice was steady, but there was a deep, guttural admission behind it. "It is atonement, Lucas." He froze, his body rigid. Ella, busy coloring on the side table, looked up, confused by the sudden, intense silence between the adults. The noise of the city, hundreds of feet below, seemed to vanish. "Atonement for what?" Lucas asked, the words barely audible, laced with a sudden, terrible suspicion that something far more sinister than business was at play. Clara didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the sterile quiet of her recovery room. She was ready to face the darkness she carried. In 2016, she began speaking slowly, measuring every syllable, focusing on the terrible accuracy of the details. Moretti Holdings, under my direct purview as the newly promoted CFO, pushed through a sweeping budget cut. It was a massive cost-saving measure to boost end-of-year profits, and it included slashing the aid budget for several non-essential humanitarian projects, including the military hospital district, the one your wife was evacuated to after the incident. Lucas was completely still, his eyes wide, vacant. The name of the hospital district echoed in his mind, instantly recalling the frantic flight home and the empty gurney. Clara continued, the words a forced confession, each syllable costing her immense effort. Your wife's emergency surgery, Lucas. It was part of that fallout. The internal investigation later confirmed that if the hospital hadn't been critically low on certain specific surgical equipment, disposable vascular clamps that the aid budget was supposed to replenish, Sarah would have had a much higher chance of survival. The delay caused by having to improvise cost precious minutes. Clara drew a shaky breath, finally articulating the truth that had poisoned her success for years. I signed the final order, Lucas. I was the one who prioritized profit over people that year. I never thought about the names, the faces, the consequences. It was just a number. And that number was your wife's life. You saved me. The person who indirectly took the one you loved, destroyed your family and ruined your faith. The atmosphere didn't just grow cold, it became utterly frigid. He stood up slowly, towering over the desk, his expression unreadable, a terrifying neutrality. He stared at the woman who had just confessed to orchestrating the circumstances of his wife's death, the one person he had subconsciously needed to find for almost 10 years. Clara braced herself for the shouting, the violence, the justified rage. She closed her eyes, ready for the torrent of hatred. But Lucas just stood there, silently processing the horrifying circle of fate. The shock was so profound that it bypassed rage and settled into a deep, silent ache. He finally broke the silence, his voice a weary sigh, stripped of all energy. Do you know, he said, looking past her to the skyline, I have hated the people who made that decision for almost a decade. I used to plot it every night. He finally met her gaze, and she saw no hatred there, only an exhausted comprehension. But looking at you right now, Clara, I don't see a monster or a villain. I only see a woman who has been punishing herself with isolation and success for years. You've been living in a private hell of your own making. Clara's polished facade shattered. She was weeping openly, uncontrollably. Aren't you angry, Lucas? Please scream at me. Hate me. You have every right to. I've lived too long with anger, he replied simply. It hasn't saved anyone. Not me, not my wife. And it certainly hasn't saved you. It's just a weight. He walked toward the door, Ella quietly following, clutching his hand. He paused with his hand on the cold brass knob. So what can I possibly do to atone for Sarah? She pleaded desperately, tears soaking her silk blouse. I'll give it all back. I'll ruin myself. Lucas turned. He looked at her with pity, not condemnation, and offered the only absolution he could afford. Live better. Make her death mean something, Clara. That's the only way. After that meeting, Clara Moretti disappeared from public view for several days. She was locked in her private residence, working nonstop, fueled by black coffee and a grim determination. The only communication was with her legal team and the head of the Moretti Foundation. Then the headlines broke. Moretti Foundation reopens massive medical aid fund. CEO Clara Moretti pledges her entire annual salary and liquidates non-essential private assets, citing a profound personal reckoning. Fund will focus on rapid response equipment deployment to underserved hospital districts. When Lucas finally saw her again, weeks later, she met him outside his apartment, looking thinner, but somehow cleaner, freer. I kept your word, she said, her hands clasped tightly, no longer waiting for his permission. I made her life mean something again. Not just for me. Lucas merely looked at the immense weight that had lifted from her shoulders. Then, he said, the corner of his mouth turning up slightly, a flicker of genuine approval, that is enough. More than enough. A business journalist who secured the first post-announcement interview later commented, I asked Ms. Moretti why she risked so much of her capital and reputation on a purely altruistic endeavor, one that targeted the very flaw her company had created. She didn't hesitate. She said, a poor man once taught me that mistakes, even unforgivable ones, can still save people, but only if you're brave enough to stop running and finally look back at the damage you've caused. My foundation isn't charity, it's a living monument to a life that shouldn't have been lost. Clara didn't stop coming to the apartment. The visits simply changed. They were no longer about duty or obligation. They were about necessity. Lucas's home was the only place Clara felt she could genuinely shed the weight of the crown she wore every day. It was the only place she was just Clara, the accident survivor. She became a fixture in their lives. She taught Ella to draw intricate anatomical sketches, encouraging her dreams of becoming a doctor, correcting her own past sins by fostering this new future. Lucas, in turn, began teaching Clara the simplest of life skills, cooking. The CEO, who commanded billions, was utterly bewildered by the act of boiling water and terrified of basic spices. One afternoon, while attempting to make simple scrambled eggs, she managed to set off the smoke detector while burning the toast. She collapsed against the counter, helpless, covered in flour. Lucas just stood there, watching the smoke clear. Then he began to laugh, a loud rolling sound that shook his whole body. Clara stared. Then tentatively, she joined him. It wasn't the rusty sound from the hospital. It was a clear, unburdened laugh, ringing with the joy of imperfection. Well, Clara wiped her eyes, still chuckling. I see why I delegated food preparation for 33 years. It's okay, Lucas said, gently taking the smoking pan from her hand. It's just toast. We'll try again. The goal isn't perfection, it's just showing up. They were two people from different galaxies, now orbiting a shared center of gravity, the simple, warm life they built together in that small, humble apartment. The process of rebuilding their lives side by side was a quiet, profound miracle. The change in Clara was remarkable. The sharpness around her eyes had softened. The perpetual tension in her jaw had eased. She was starting to look less like the Ice Queen and more like a human being, vulnerable, present, and kind. She had started therapy, dealing with the trauma and the guilt, but the real healing, she knew, happened right here, over burnt toast and crayon drawings. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the couch watching a cartoon with Ella, the little girl turned to Clara with unexpected earnestness. Ms. Clara, Ella asked, tilting her head, are you afraid to die now? Clara paused. Lucas's hand instinctively reached for hers, ready for the pain. I was, sweetie, Clara admitted, her voice low, honest. I was absolutely terrified, and I wanted it over because I felt like a mistake. But now I'm not. She squeezed Lucas's hand lightly. Because there are people in the world who show you that you have unfinished business. People who make you desperately want to live and fix what you broke. Lucas looked at her then, seeing a clear, deep well of emotion in her eyes. The steel was gone, replaced by a deep, growing light. The soul of a woman who was slowly, painstakingly, relearning how to trust, how to hope, and how to believe in her own worth, independent of her title or her wealth. As the holiday season approached, a fragile, unspoken bond settled between them, defined by deep mutual redemption. They were linked by a mistake, a death, and a rescue. On Christmas Eve, the three of them sat quietly by Ella's paper tree, the only sound the crackle of a cheap electric heater. Clara presented Ella with a gift, a small antique music box, delicately etched with a floral pattern. Engraved on the brass surface were the words, "For every life that saved another." Clara didn't look at Lucas when she spoke. She looked at the dancing reflection of the lights on the music box. I used to whisper, "Please make it fast," she said softly, confessing her lowest moment. It was all I wanted. But now, Lucas, all I wish for is for every beautiful, messy moment we share to slow down. I don't want to rush anything anymore. From today, I choose to look at each other for one beat longer. I will live kindly. A year passed, defined by action, not regret, a conscious decision to choose light over the shadow of the past. The Moretti Foundation, focused exclusively on rapid response emergency medical aid, flourished. It had saved hundreds of poor patients, providing critical, immediate funding to hospitals that had once been ignored. The foundation's success was visceral, measured in lives retrieved from the brink. Lucas Reed, the former nurse who had lost his faith, had found his calling again. He resigned from the ambulance company and became the volunteer manager for the foundation. His trauma care skills were finally put to use without the crippling fear of personal failure. He managed aid distribution and helped train community groups in essential first aid and critical response skills. He was upholding Sarah's legacy, unknowingly fulfilled by the person who had caused her death. The culmination of the year's work was the annual Foundation Appreciation Ceremony, held in the same glass headquarters where the truth had been confessed. Clara, poised, radiant, and wearing a hopeful emerald green dress, stood on the stage, addressing a crowd of doctors, volunteers, and benefactors. I once wanted to die because I truly thought I wasn't worthy of living, she confessed, her voice ringing clear in the grand hall. I carried a silent, destructive guilt, believing I had directly caused a tremendous loss. She paused. She told the story of the crash, the whisper, and the realization that saving a life meant more than all the wealth she possessed. But then, she continued, her eyes sweeping the audience until they landed on Lucas, who was sitting proudly with Ella in the front row. Someone told me that as long as we can still save someone, we still have value. We can replace what was lost with a million new chances. This foundation is not my penance. It is my second chance. It is the living proof that a mistake can be transformed into a miracle. Her gaze met his, a look of profound gratitude, peace, and love. The Ice Queen was truly gone, melted away by the warmth of a life she didn't deserve but chose to build. In her place was a woman redeemed by her own actions and supported by a man who taught her how to forgive herself. After the ceremony concluded, Ella, beaming with excitement, rushed forward. She grabbed Clara's hand with one of hers and Lucas's hand with the other. This Christmas, the little girl declared, pulling them together, ignoring the crowd of billionaires and philanthropists, we are taking a family picture, the three of us. Clara froze, her smile briefly faltering at the powerful word, family. It was a concept she had never allowed herself to contemplate. She looked at Lucas, who simply nodded, his eyes full of tenderness and a quiet, settled acceptance of the beautiful, complicated life they now shared. Clara smiled, a true, easy smile that reached her soul. Okay, Ella, she agreed, squeezing the child's hand. Let's do it. Our family picture. That photograph, taken moments later under a gentle falling of snow outside the headquarters, became the foundation's iconic image. It showed the three of them, the CEO, the former nurse, and the hopeful little girl, standing together, united not by blood, but by destiny and a shared history of pain and healing. It was atonement made real, a future built from the wreckage of the past. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.